Hey everybody, it's Derek here. Thanks as always for stopping by. So it's February 25th, which means we're still in Black History Month. Not too far from the end now. And I've got another nonfiction here for you. This is, I rated this 5 stars on Goodreads, and I can't wait to tell you about it. This was an incredible book. So we're talking about Caste, the origin of our discontents. It's written by a very impressive woman, Isabel Wilkerson. It actually won the Oprah's Book Club Award in 2020 when it was published. So it's a few years old, but still extremely relevant. It's not a terribly big book. After the endnotes, you're looking at about 441 pages. So getting to be a little lengthy, but certainly very approachable. Her language is approachable. She is a Pulitzer Prize winner, winner of National Humanities Medal. This is a New York Times bestseller. I think The Warmth of Other Suns, her precursor, was also a New York Times bestseller. She's a very accomplished lecturer. She lectures at more than 200 other colleges and universities across the United States. She's just a very, very impressive woman. So while she's not the first person to relate, the role of African Americans in the United States to a caste structure. There have been others. For example, I'm about to review this book here in the next video. The New Jim Crow does refer to African Americans as being the bottom rung of a caste system. She takes a psychological and an anthropological look at the untouchables in India, and where it's a very stratified society. Also, what went on during the Nazi experiment, and how the Nazis imported much of the methods, especially legal methods, that the United States had used to keep blacks down. They imported a lot of that in dealing with the Jewish question over in Germany. So that was really interesting. It's not so much a statistical view of the problems. So if that's what you're looking for, there are statistics in there, of course, but it's not a really deep dive into that. It's more of a psychological and I would say an anthropological look at the caste system with African Americans being on the lowest rung. And you can say that that's, race baiting, or you can say it's a way of moving yourself up the victim pyramid, as people like, Matt Walsh or everybody basically at the Daily Wire would put it. I would say they're completely off base, and she's right on point. There is a caste system. We think of the United States being so advanced, technologically and economically, and how we're too far beyond there ever being a caste system. But when you actually take a historical view and actually look at the psychology of it, of how caste works, I think she hits the nail on the head. It's not hyperbole. So I really enjoyed this book, and I want to talk about the difference between caste for a moment and class, or other ways that you can stratify society. And she, right at the outset, she explains it like this, that caste is like grammar in speech. All of us can participate in speech, and know, for example, very common rules of when you're listing something in a sentence. For example, we know what order to put them in, especially when we're writing and we have a time to formulate our ideas. Most people understand how the language works. There might be some trivial details that we don't know, and we need an editor for that sort of thing. But most people can at least communicate their thoughts in such a way that they can be understood and, roughly follow the rules of grammar. And she says, you don't have to take an English course or anything in order to do that. It's something that we kind of pick up through osmosis, right? Well, she says caste functions in much the same way. What makes caste so complicated in certain directions is when you see how, you can look at how the races, for example, are stratified with the whitest races being the most privileged. As you get darker and darker and darker, it seems, your value goes along down with it. Now, caste, you can have a lot of stratification across economic lines and gender lines, both within groups like the African American race, or within other races, or even within the LGBTQ, and the way those groups interact with one another can also be, there can be caste rules at play, and sometimes things don't fall perfectly within caste. So she does outline that we're not talking about a perfect science here, but certainly from an anthropological view, society does stratify. And she shows how blacks really are at the bottom of the bottom rung. And how, even when Martin Luther King visited India, he was brought before a group of untouchables there. Someone introduced Martin Luther King and said, "I bring you an American untouchable." And even he had said, Martin Luther King that is, that when I heard that, I kind of recoiled, and I didn't like that. I had a lot of resistance to this idea, but he says the more I got to think about it, that's exactly what's going on. And you can see how this structure is kept in place procedurally, and also on the unwritten level, sort of the grammar of how people behave towards one another. She brings up a lot of scenarios throughout this book of how people will do things that they would never otherwise get away with if it were happening within a group of white people, say. People will step out of place and take a lot of liberty and have a lot of entitlement and do it in very threatening, subtle ways. So I found that really interesting. And the thing that shocked me and disappointed me the most, again, because we're so conditioned by American exceptionalism out here, she shows how the Nazis, many higher ups who wanted to implement a caste system, we're talking sort of in the early to mid 30s, around the time of the Kristallnacht and all that. Many of the higher ups, I can't remember these names off the top of my head, but many of them were like, if only we could execute it as good as the Americans did. There was an interesting comment brought up after the Nuremberg trials. Some anecdote was brought up about, what would have been the proper punishment for Hitler if he was actually, if he survived and actually went through the Nuremberg trials. And one lady said someone should tan his hide and send him to America to live as a black person. That would be the perfect punishment. Let him live as a black person, and then he would understand what it was like to be the Jew during the Nazi experiment. So this stood out to me, this book, a lot through Black History Month. I know there's quite a division in Booktube here between nonfiction and fiction, and of course even reading fantasies and YA and things like that. This was definitely a little more up my alley. I think you really get into the psychology of what it is for the rank and file black person, especially in the United States. Although even here in Canada, we have that stratification as well. It's not quite as bad, at least I don't think so from my reading and from my observation. But, we still have a long ways to go in racial relations and extending truly equal rights. And even if we have to take an outcomes-based approach, I know some people are resistant to the whole idea of equity, but I think it's unavoidable. Culture does that, whether you actively and intentionally do it or not. Culture is going to do it for you. So you better have some artificial, barriers in place to make sure that we don't go back in time and lose a lot of the ground that was gained through the civil rights era, for example, and even since then. And in many ways, actually, we are backsliding, certainly when it comes to voting rights in the United States, also when it comes to law enforcement, especially incarceration. I'm about to talk again about another book, The New Jim Crow, and we haven't fully escaped Jim Crow type segregation and apartheid, although it's not as structural anymore. It's not as procedural. So I highly recommend this book, guys. Definitely read it if you can. And if you have read this, I would love to hear your thoughts on it below in the comments. All right. Thanks as always for stopping by, and we'll see you in the next one. Hey everyone, I hope you liked this video. If you want more like the one you just watched, click the suggested video on this screen. Make sure you subscribe, and to connect with me on my other platforms, my handles are linked below in the description, alright? Take care, peeps. Till next time.